All right, so now we'll talk about dimensionality reduction, which I like. It's a sort of mathematical concept. And so we'll talk about the fundamental problem with all machine learning systems, especially computer vision systems, is you have far too much data coming in, and you can't possibly process all that data in any reasonable amount of time. So, for example, on an iPhone, the main camera resolution is 24 megapixels. So that means every picture has 24 million pixels, each of which has three colors. And so that's crazy. That's a lot of data. So if you consider a self-driving car, it's got LiDAR, GPS, a front camera, ultrasonic sensors, and all this jazz. All this data is coming in. Many millions of data points are coming in, many times per second. So how can you possibly train or use a model? And the answer is you cannot. So what you must do is engage in dimensionality reduction. Somehow you're going to have to decide to ignore almost all of that data and keep only a small number of data points and use them. So that's the game. And your brain does this with, I think it's the amygdala. There's a special brain structure just to regulate attention, and its purpose is to discard all the unimportant information. So that's what we have to do. All right, so here's, you can do it with projection or manifold learning, and there are techniques, and the most important one is principal component analysis, but we'll mention the others. But by far the most popular technique is PCA. So the first thing, you can understand mathematically the dimensionality. So if you've normalized your data, so your data goes from 0 to 1 along a certain number of dimensions, then the question is, how many points does it take to trace something out? And we've done this before. If you have a function that is curvy like this, you say, how many points do you need to define this? And well, if you only had 1 point or just 2 points and they were on the edge, you couldn't possibly trace this shape. You're going to need perhaps 10 or 20 points, more or less evenly spaced across this to trace out that curve. So, all right. So we have to consider how likely are we to have points that actually trace out the dependence through the range of a variable here. And the point is, you can count how many points there are near an edge. And here I define being near an edge by being less than 0.01. And so if we make 1,000 points and just count how many of them, randomly place them and see how many are near the edge, if you only have 2 dimensions, then only a few points are near the edge, 25 out of 1,000. But if you get up to 1,000 dimensions, then of course, since you have 1,000 random numbers, it's very likely that one of them is going to be near an edge. So what happens is, if you have a lot of dimensions, all the points are on an edge. Another way to look at it is the area, the volume near an edge keeps growing faster than the number of dimensions. So this means your samples are not at all going to represent some of these dimensions. You're not going to be able to trace out the variation across these dimensions. You can do it with the volume of a hypercube also. If you consider a hypercube here, how much of the volume is not near an edge? And it turns out, of course, for low dimensions, most of the volume is in the middle, but for high numbers of dimensions, almost none of the volume is in the middle. Almost all the volume is on one edge or another, and that's the problem. So if you're guessing, if you're trying to get data to trace this out, you'll never make it. And another way to do it is look at the distance between points. If you just choose a certain number of random points, how far apart are they? In dimensions of 2, a square, the points are 0.5 apart, but in higher dimensions, the points are very far apart. So you have the entire range of an input parameter is 1, and yet your points are separated by a distance of 400, so they can't possibly trace the shape of the curve in there. So that means you can never have enough data to trace out a curve in all those dimensions. No matter how much data you collect, it could never possibly be enough to trace out the actual dependence on all those variables. All right, so you can never sample them all. For example, if you wanted to get data in every 0.1, so you had 10 data points for every dimension, in 100 dimensions, that would be 10 to the 100 points required to do that. So you can never possibly have that much data no matter what you do. Right. And so the human vision does this. It goes through, I guess it's the thalamus. I thought the amygdala was involved too. But anyway, the point is you have the same problem with your real eye. Your real eye is picking up a lot of data, and you run it through brain functions that decide what part of it is important, and you only process the important data, not at all the data. So we need to do the same thing. So one way to do it is to just project it to a smaller dimensional space. So if you have a three-dimensional series of dots, you can project them onto a plane, and now they're lowered to 2 dimensions. So if there's a plane where the information on that plane is what you need, and you don't really care about the distance off the plane, then you can do this. So that's a way to lower dimensionality. After projection, you now reduced it to a 2-dimensional problem. So you have removed information, but if you do it carefully, you preserve the important information. Another one is manifold learning. Here, if you have data that follows like a curve here, and so it's following a natural progression of colors along this curve, but if you project it onto a plane, you're going to mix the colors together. You're going to lose important information. So that's not good. So in that case, what you would want to do is to project it onto a curved shape, which can in principle be done. This is manifold learning. You follow the shape of it and lower it to a 2-dimensional structure, but the right 2-dimensional structure that preserves the trend. So in the MNIST data, consider this. Every image is 28 by 28 pixels of grayscale, so we have 784 dimensions. But if you really had 784 independent dimensions that explored all possible values, the images would look like this. And that is, of course, not the way they look. If you look at these, for example, the edges are almost always white, so those dimensions don't contain any information at all. And the dots in the middle are not random, they're lines, just curves drawn. So once you have one black dot, a bunch of dots near it are also going to be black. So those are not really independent dimensions of equal value. So the actual amount of information here is far less than 784 times 256. You've encoded it in a high-dimensional space, but you really don't have that much information, or the images would all look like this. All right, so here's another decision boundary, which here you're going to have a thing wrapped around a spiral here, and the dark green is thick at this end, and it gradually gets thinner at the other end. So the decision boundary in this 3-dimensional space would be very complicated, but if you project it to the 2-dimensional space, the decision boundary is just a straight line. So that's the problem may well be much easier once you lower the dimensions. Here's a decision boundary that's simple in 3D, where I just have a vertical plane here, so all the dots on one side are dark and all the dots on the other side are light, but when you flatten it out, that becomes a more complicated decision boundary because you cut these pieces up. So that's an issue. Reducing dimensionality certainly makes the mathematics easier, but it may not lead to a simpler or better solution. So you have to consider how to reduce dimensionality and still preserve the important information. And that's where we hit principal component analysis. And the trick here is, if you have data like this in X1 and X2, varying both of them, then what you do is you consider various possible combinations of these parameters, so combining them together to point in directions, and you find the direction that will catch the most variation. So here, if I go along this line and measure in this dimension, all the data is a very small distance up and down here. So if I project it onto this plane, it all just collapses to a little skinny thing. But if I project it onto this plane, it gets very wide. So this is the most important one. You just find which projection will give you the widest variation, and that is what's called the principal component. This is the most important thing to capture the most variance. So you find the plane that preserves the most variance, or another way to look at it is you minimize the deviation from the plane. These are equivalent ways to express the same thing. That's the principal component. So you find the plane that captures the most of it, then you subtract out that information, And then you find a second axis orthogonal to the first one that captures most of the remaining variance, and you can continue this way as long as you like to have as many principal components as you need. All right, and you can express this mathematically as a matrix factorization technique. So now you just have to decide how much variance do you want to explain. And you can just choose. So for example, maybe it would be enough to get 95% of the variance, or maybe you want to reduce down to a certain number of dimensions so you can visualize the data. There are various ways to go. So as you retain the number of dimensions, the more dimensions you retain, the more variance you get. And so you can choose where to stop. And typically you find the point of diminishing returns, the elbow in the curve, where it would take a lot more dimensions to get more variance. All right. So the number of dimensions is a regularization hyperparameter, if you like, and you can adjust it to capture as much of the information as you want within your computational limits. And if you don't know anything about what to choose, you can just try a randomized search with randomized values until you find one that works, like all other hyperparameters we talked about. So you can apply this to the MNIST dataset, and we'll do this in the project, where you can, if you have 784 dimensions, if you want 95% of the variance, you only need 154 of those dimensions. So that shrinks the data set a lot. And you can then reconstruct the images with only the features you kept to see how much information has been lost. And in this case, it's not very much. As you can see, this 4, the lines got a little bit blurrier, but with keeping the 150 or so dimensions, you really capture almost all the information in the original. You can see the contrast has gone down a bit, but the shape of the numbers is well preserved. All right, and another way is to use a random algorithm to approximate the first few components. That's a way to do it, so you can make it faster by sacrificing some accuracy. And then there's incremental. If the training set is too large to fit into memory, then you use mini batches like we have done in the forest, where you use only part of the data to do the calculation, since you can't calculate on it all. That's another way to do it. Right, and there are other ways to do it. You can do random projection, where you just use a random linear projection. And that's easy to do. You're going to catch a random amount of the variance, but that's one way to do it. You don't use the data at all. You just project it down to a lower dimension. There's mathematics of this. You can shrink the dimensions quite a lot that way, but you are losing some of the information. You can do sparse random projection, where you choose random axes that go along your original parameters, so you make sure most cells are zero. So you don't just choose a random hyperplane, you choose a random hyperplane that is mostly going along most of the axes, so most of the cells are zero. That will make the calculation faster and use less memory. All right. Then there's locally linear embedding, where you can compare each training instance to its nearest neighbors and find a low-dimensional representation in that local range. And what this will do is it will follow it. So you follow it over a little range, locally linear, then linear, then linear. So you follow the shape of the data, and you'll get a projection like this. That way you don't have to have a simple mathematical expression of the shape. You can just follow the shape like an ant crawling across the surface. That's another way to do it. There's other techniques. Multi-dimensional scaling reduces dimensionality while preserving distance, but you only keep the distance between instances. There's something called isomap that tries to preserve something called the geodesic distance. There's just various different mathematical ways to lower dimensionality. There's a stochastic neighbor embedding, which tries to keep similar instances close and dissimilar instances apart, and something called linear discriminant that defines a hyperplane and tries to preserve the distances. And so these will take that thing and turn it into these various different distorted things. But you can see they've all projected it down to 2 dimensions, that curved sort of cinnamon roll looking thing, in very different ways. So they all accomplish the goal, but the one we're going to use is the main one, principal component analysis, and that's coming next. So let me stop this video.